everybody, and you're all very welcome to the Direct Sligo webinar. We're going to be talking this afternoon about the new EU Forest Strategy. And just to say that those of you who are logged on Eventbrite can ask questions via the chat facility on that, and also welcome to those who are watching our live Facebook stream. We have three speakers this afternoon. We have Mark Onida, Directorate General for Environment at the European Commission, Brendan Fitzsimons, who's the CEO of the Tree Council of Ireland, and Dermot McAree, who's Director of Crown Trees for Ireland. Now, the draft EU Forest Strategy is under consideration at the moment. The aim of this webinar is to alert the public to the fact that there is a public consultation process around this. And this is actually the third element of putting the strategy in place and researching it. And we're encouraging people to make a submission for the EU Forest Strategy. And this is the third and final part of the consultation process. So what we're going to be doing is discussing and highlighting the positive potentials of the plan, not just around how increased forestry can contribute to meeting the target of making Europe climate neutral by 2050, but also looking at other environmental, social and economic perspectives, and particularly how Ireland can contribute to the forest strategy, not just nationally and EU-wide, but worldwide as well. We're going to be using words like pathology, etymology, bioeconomy, green industry, social and physical use. But don't worry, anytime I don't understand a word, I'll be asking the panellists, so I'll make sure you understand too. We really want to make sure people have a good grasp of the potential for this forestry strategy and to take the opportunity to be involved in the public consultation. At the moment, the strategy aims to have 3 billion trees planted over its lifetime. So what we want to look at is how to put the right tree in the right place and what sort of tree it's going to be, that it's to the benefit of the positive outcomes for everybody. So I'm going to introduce you to our three speakers. I'm going to go over to Marco first and just ask you to introduce yourself, Marco, and say what organisation you're with.
Good afternoon to all. In Ireland, Marco Onida from the Directorate General of the Environment of the European Commission. I'm responsible for a forest team in the unit dealing with land use and management. And I'm co-leading on this file, the forest strategy, with my colleagues of the Directors General for Agriculture and Director General for Climate. But this is a transversal file, so we are working together with the colleagues.
Wonderful, thanks Marco. So you'll be able to give us a good overview of the strategy. Next, I'm going to go over to Brendan. Maybe you can tell us a little bit about what you're representing, Brendan, what organisation. Thank you.
Okay, Brendan Fitzsimons here. I'm CEO of the Tree Council of Ireland, which is an umbrella group representing about 40 different organisations that are interested in or involved in trees. And that ranges from forestry companies to Untashka to NGOs and local authorities. So we cover the whole range. We're an advocacy group for planting more trees, really. Our motto is establishing a tree culture in Ireland.
Wonderful, thank you for that. And I'm going to call next on Dermot McAree to tell us about your organisation and what perspective you'll be taking today.
Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Dermot McAree. I'm fortunate to be the director of an NGO organisation called Crown Trees for Ireland. And our objective is to enhance the environment in Ireland by planting, promoting, protecting, and increasing awareness about trees and woodlands. Our mission statement, everyone has a mission statement these days, is simply to ensure that we plant the right tree in the right place, as Maeve has said. I'm also involved with in the UN on a team of specialists on green jobs in the forest sector, which I hope to speak about later, and also acting as a forest advisor to an EU Erasmus Plus group called Forest for Health. So I might discuss that later with Marco. So that's me, but the main take-home message that we have in Crown is plant the right tree in the right place. Thanks, Maeve.
Thanks, Dermot. I hope I didn't steal your thunder there by quoting you in advance.
I'm delighted you did. We're getting there.
I'm going to go over to Marco first. And what I'd like to ask you, Marco, please, is to outline for us an overview of the EU forest strategy. I suppose looking at what context it's been created in, and also maybe to touch on what's the role of forests in the European Green Deal. Because really, you can't talk about one strategy without perhaps mentioning other strategies too.
Yes, happy to do that. So, as the title says, the strategy is a long-term political program. It is one of the mentioned deliverables under the European Green Deal. European Green Deal, as you might know, is the strategic political priority program of the new European Commission that was adopted in December 2019. And the European Green Deal mentions directly the need for a new EU forest strategy that covers the whole cycle of forest and that will lead to better climate, better biodiversity, and better possibilities for the bioeconomy. Now, this is a strategy, so it's going to be a non-binding instrument as a communication that's going to be proposed by European Commission. It's going to be adopted by European Commission. So we're not talking about binding rules. We're talking about a strategy. But this is very important because forest is a topic which lies between the EU and the member states. So it's very important to set the strategic boundaries of what then the member states do in order to improve their strategies, their forest, their biodiversity, their strategy for climate, and so on. What is important to say at this stage is that compared to the past, forests have been recognized to be really at the heart of the two major crises we are living in, which is the climate crisis and the biodiversity loss crisis. And forests are seen as the solution, or one of the solutions for both. But the two crises are like two sides of the same coin, so they have to be tackled together. The forest strategy, as you also correctly said, is under consideration. It's not yet adopted. It's planned for the year 2021. It will be most likely before the summer. So we have published a roadmap in October, which lays down the main objectives of the strategy. I'm happy to talk about that later if you want. And then in January, we published an open public consultation because this is not only based on the so-called better regulation methodology, which requires to involve citizens and stakeholders as much as possible in drafting the Commission policy documents, but also because forest is really touching at the heart of local communities, stakeholders, forest owners, NGOs, everybody has become a tree hugger today. And that's why we really are thankful to you for this event that allows us to make a little bit of advertisement of the open public consultation, which is open until the 19th of April this year.
Okay, thank you, Marcus. So it's really important to stress that this strategy, as well as being a wider strategy, it can in fact affect individuals, communities, areas. So really that it's important that if we want to have, to say something about it or to influence, we do get our spoke in. I think particularly during COVID times, I know I'm using my local woods and doing lots more tree hugging than I would have previously. You mentioned that there's a roadmap you've put out already as part of the first two sections of the consultation process. Are there particular problems that outlines that it wishes to tackle, and maybe how does it hope to tackle these?
Well, yes, I think that the main aspect is how to combine the fact that forests have different functions. Forests are multifunctional. Now, we are under the Green Deal under a perspective where, of course, climate and biodiversity are put in the forefront, but we shouldn't forget that forests are also at the heart of a lot of bioeconomy related. How can we ensure that future forests, also taking into account the fact that the life cycle of trees is much longer than the life cycle of mankind. Therefore, we are here to set principles for future forests because it's difficult to change the destiny of the existing forests, because what we're living with today in terms, for instance, of vulnerability, fragility vis-a-vis in relation to climate change depends very much on choices that were made 70, 80 years ago. So we have to start thinking about the forests of the future in a long-term perspective and combine all the necessary elements in one. We have to increase the resilience of forests, projecting the future climatic conditions, knowing what the climate will bring in 20, 30, 40 years, in order to make sure that the 3 billion trees that we want to plant today, which is only one tiny part of the forest strategy, because the forest strategy is much more, but it also includes the requirement to have a roadmap for the 3 billion, so-called 3 billion trees pledge. These will be alive in 50 years. There will not be 3 billion trees, 3 billion saplings that in 10 years will be suffering for droughts or forest fires and so on. So we have to take into account a large number of aspects: genetic diversity, the need to ensure that the biomass is used within the boundaries of what are natural resources without impinging on biodiversity. We have to be sure that we plant the right tree in the right place, and so on and so forth. I could go on for a long, but let's say the major challenge is to combine all these multifunctionality characters of forests in one strategy, which would be like holistic and encompassing all these aspects in one.
Okay, so we're looking at, we have many different types of forests, and it's really, really important to think about where we want these forests to be in the future and how we want them to develop. So I'm going to move over now. I'm going to ask Brendan and Dermot. I'll come to you first, Brendan. Just from that point of view, from the perspective of Ireland, if you were approaching planting in Ireland, and from the perspective of biodiversity and things like green forest jobs, which you might come to later, how would you approach a planting system, shall we say? Or I'll let you tell me how to term that.
And this is a personal view more than the Tree Council per se. I think the first is we have to recognise that there may well be, on certain sites in certain areas, a conflict between the biodiversity agenda and the carbon lockup. And we need to kind of prioritise it. I tend to fear climate change more, because at the end of the day, if in 30, and we've only 30 years to cap global warming at 1.5 degrees. After that, we're into a runaway situation. So if we don't stop that, preserving biodiversity in various bits and pieces will be irrelevant, because it'll all be wiped out, possibly along with much of humanity, in a very hot global world. So I think we need to clarify more exactly, we need to have a functional plan. And the reason I mentioned that in the case of Ireland is because, as you know, we've had problems planting recently. Our planting program has collapsed from 10,000 hectares a year down to about 2 at the moment, largely because it is coming up against a whole host of other environmental priorities. And that's something we really have to get to grips with, because without that, we haven't a prayer of planting enough trees to have any impact whatsoever by 2030. Just to give you an idea, if you look at a conifer plantation, in 30 years' time, it'll be fairly locking up a lot of carbon, probably about 650 tons per hectare, and that's only at the above ground, but I'm just doing that to compare. Again, let's say we were just to do that with native woodlands, we'd be locking up somewhere maybe about 50 tons per hectare by the year 2050. And I suppose the issue there is we're making the good the enemy of the perfect, if you like, or vice versa, because we're only 11% tree cover in Ireland, which is very, very low anyway. We need to get up to around 30%. And we need to seriously put in place trees that, will lock up carbon. And again, there's an economic issue around that. There's the whole forest industry, which is threatened. But I mean, the other thing is the sheer cost. Again, just not to simplify it too much, but basically you can plant Sitka spruce once you get the land for, say, nothing, essentially, because it pays for itself. The cost establishing a native woodland, even an oak plantation in plantation mode, never mind a native woodland per se, is up to about €16,000 per hectare if you look at the grant scheme, with no return in that time frame. Now, I'm not saying in 200 years' time they'll even out, but we don't have 200 years, we have 30 years. And I'm often concerned that, it's interesting, the environmentalists were the very first 40, 50 years ago to sound the alarm on climate change. But I suppose we really need to think on the science, and we need to range our priorities. I feel that people haven't actually internalized what the consequences of runaway global warming is, and we're only tweaking around at the edges. But obviously I feel we need a very significant tree planting program, certainly to bring us up to the European average, which we're at the very bottom of the table, bar Malta, so we're at the bottom of the table.
Thanks, Brendan. So you're looking at or reminding us that we would need to, I suppose, tie in with this policy from the point of view of positive environmental impact to have 30% of Ireland under trees within the life of whatever by 2050. So the question begs then, you've talked about conifers, we'll be talking about broadleaves, and just related to that, you mentioned that we have to decide what our environmental priorities are. Are certain types of trees going to give us a quicker return on making us more carbon neutral than others? And I suppose it's how we balance those two things with environmental needs and with other needs. Dermot, do you have anything to say on that, planting from the perspectives of biodiversity? I'll come back to you then, Brendan.
It's important. We in Crown would like to congratulate the Commission on engaging on this very comprehensive strategy, and we'd ask everybody in Ireland to get their spoke in about how they feel about it by April the 19th. So I think in relation to Ireland, specifically in relation to biodiversity, carbon and all the questions you asked, I think we should reintroduce the concept of a code of best forest practice, which we had some time ago in Ireland. We had a code of best forest practice which stipulated that all forest operations should be done in accordance with sustainable forest management, and that all timber produced in Ireland should derive from sustainably managed forest. Now, I see this in the EU strategy, where there's talk about that every forest operation in Crown, we feel, whether it's conifer or broadleaf or anything, there are three criteria for anything to do with a forest operation, we feel, in Ireland and indeed in the European Union, where you're going to plant 3 billion trees. Now, it's most important that the forestry program that's undertaken to achieve this is, first of all, that it's economically viable. There's no use spending money on planting trees that will be eaten by deer or that will be eaten by rabbits or will die from disease. So it has to be economically viable. Again, Maeve, I think you asked the question about the location of species. A forest operation has to be socially acceptable. You have to have buy-in from the community. It's no use having a forest overlooking, if I had a nice vista on my farm and suddenly there was this, dark forest, you have to have landscape considerations. And thirdly, and again, most importantly, environmentally appropriate. So the three criteria, before we talk about anything else, you have to have literally economically viable. We've spent a lot of money on trees in the European Union and in Ireland where there was failure with the wrong tree in the wrong place. So we have to overcome that. And we have the expertise and the technology now to do that. We also have to make sure that there's forest operations, tree planting is socially acceptable. And I would encourage the EU in their strategy to be a bit more positive about all the aspects, the multifunctionality. I know it's mentioned, but I would like to see the European Union, and again, this would be taken up in Ireland, to have a campaign about what we call in Crown the magic molecule. This is identifying chlorophyll as foresters are chlorophyll managers. And I said it to my students years ago that if I came on a program and I was dressed in a white coat as a scientist, and I told somebody I had just come back from my laboratory and I had invented a molecule that was able to take carbon dioxide, this compound that is causing global warming, out of the atmosphere, convert it into cellulose, and then give off oxygen that we are breathing. I mean, one mature tree gives off enough oxygen for a family of 4 for 1 year. The other thing is that one tree will take out the equivalent of fumes from a car that drives for about 10,000 or 18,000 kilometers or 10,000 miles, 1 year. And also, I just like to make the point, and I think it should be highlighted in our forest policy, that cellulose, the building block of trees, is today anything that is derived from fossil fuels can now be derived from cellulose. So you're into biotechnology. I see a fantastic opportunity for the biotechnology industry to get involved with cellulose. And again, I'm not taking away from the question you asked, but I do think that no matter where we plant our trees, no matter what species we use, it has to be the right tree, the right place. It has to be economically viable. It has to be socially acceptable, and it should be environmentally sound. And then on we go. I think at 11%, I'm a forester, and I think it's appalling, absolutely appalling, that we have only 11%. I think that's right, Brendan, 11% of our country under forest. The potential is there, and I see it in terms of biotechnology, in terms of green jobs. I'm involved with a United Nations group that has identified unbelievable potential for green jobs in the forest sector. I'll give you one example. One example would be the whole biotech sector, where maybe in the future we'll be driving, before we go to hydrogen in cars and before we all buy an electric car, we may be driving our car with methanol, a product derived from cellulose. And it doesn't have to be a fantastic crop of wood or timber. There is great potential. So listen, those are just a few ideas that I have, and I look forward to this strategy being implemented.
Great, thanks Dermot. So I suppose going back to what Brendan was also saying about, and yourself too, really how important it is to keep climate change very near the top of the agenda, at the top of the agenda when it comes to a forestry plan, but also this notion of taking into your, as well as your environmental, your social and economic requirements. And I think you made a very good suggestion there that if a code of practice is put in place, that would really help to do that. And again, this is something that we can do in Ireland and can bear that in mind if people are giving opinions to the public consultation element of the EU forestry plan. And I suppose just on other strategies, I'm going to mention two things, say a forestry contingency plan for around climate change in Ireland, and also the McKinnon report, which looked at, ways of putting in place afforestation and proposals for forestry related operations. Do you think the implementation of these plans can tie in with the EU forestry strategy? I'll go back to you, Brendan, on that question initially.
Yeah, I've read the McKinnon report and the Joe O'Hara report, if you like, about the McKinnon report. I think it's absolutely vital because, as I said before, we're in a gridlock here now. We need to plant trees. We have a target for planting trees and all the rest of it. And it's been blocked, essentially, by other environmental measures. Often backed by EU, or like the Irish interpretation of EU regulations. And we've got ourselves into a terrible bind, a terrible knot there that needs to be untied. Otherwise, we're going nowhere. And McKinnon, in Scotland, they managed to interpret the same EU rules and regulations in a much more facilitating way in terms of forest and tree cover development, and I think it's absolutely vital that it be implemented. And I think one of the things like that, we should have probably a forestry commissar or champion or whatever you want, whose main target is to actually get the trees in the ground. We don't have much time. 2050, anything planted after 2035 essentially won't be contributing very much. Even the fast-growing conifers will only have contributed if you get them in the ground before 2040. So we're really looking at about a 20-year window to plant about twice as many trees as we have in the ground at the moment. So there's a vast scope for all types of trees, broadleaves, conifers, commercial trees, etc., etc. It's just to be wary, or to be aware of the fact, A, that we're in a real crisis situation. We're a train in a tunnel running towards a brick wall on climate. And the other thing, to be aware, just aware, I'm not saying because I won't be coming out of my pocket, hopefully not much of it anyway, that to try and do that with only native, and there's a big question mark over the concept of a native tree given the history of the Ice Age, etc. But I won't go into that now, it would take too long. The idea of doing that only with native woodlands would be ferociously expensive. We'd be looking at spending about $2 billion a year starting next year, for the next 15 years to get it all on the ground and so forth. And then you would have a solution that's about maybe 10% or less as effective as commercial trees. There's room for both, ample room for both. As I say, we're 11% forested, or Dermot said. The average European figure is 30-something percent. It should not be, conifers versus broadleaves. It should not be biodiversity versus Sitka spruce. There's absolutely no place for that, because both of them, if they're replacing agricultural land, both of them are giving much more biodiversity and a much better carbon balance. Instead of emitting the stuff, they're locking it out. They're also reducing input of chemicals. They're helping water quality, all sorts of things. So I say it's a big topic, but I don't get into every detail of it.
Okay, we are limited in time, all right, Brendan, you're right. So I suppose to come back to what you're saying, to go from 11% to 30%, we need a measured approach and a common sense approach and a complementary approach between the different types of trees that are planted that are suitable for different types of land in different parts of the country. I'm also going to pick up, just going back to what Marco was saying, that this is a strategy. Now, strategies, recommendations, those aren't enforced, or it's a plan. So really, just to pick up on what you were saying too, Brendan, about that we need a forestry champion. I think that's a very good point to bear in mind, that if a strategy, when the strategy is put in place, that it's the implementation of it that really is going to prove how successful it is, how Ireland chooses to implement it. Is it to the letter of each strategy, or is there compromise or not, and how all that works?
Yeah,
I think one of the problems. Sure.
I was just going to say, I think one of the problems that forestry has in Ireland is that they've always been a part of the Department of Agriculture or some such mix, and it's never been given the priority that it needs. And in fact, there's a conflict of interest because, let's be honest, agriculture and forestry are often competing for the same land.
Okay. Anything do you want to say on that, Dermot, before I move on to the next section?
Yeah, I'd like to react to that whenever it's possible.
Sorry, Marco.
No.
Does Marco want to come in here?
To react as well. No, go ahead first.
Maeve, who do you give the baton to?
Okay, we'll go Dermot, then Marco. Is that okay? Thanks.
Yeah.
So Dermot.
I'd like to think, again, going back, that I'd say agriculture and forestry should be complementary. To take a point that I'd like to see that traditionally farmers were encouraged to grow livestock and plants, and they were not encouraged to plant trees. But I reckon, again, in a strategy for Ireland, I would suggest, and I mentioned this before, that if farmers have sheep and cattle and stuff that are emitting methane and greenhouse gases, a very simple calculation would be to find out the amount of trees that would offset or balance out the emissions. So say, for example, I hate going into statistics, but say, for example, you had 10 head of cattle and they were giving off so many pounds or CO2 or methane. There are very simple ways of planting the equivalent in trees that would sequester that which was emitted by farm animals. You'd also have a very biodiverse farm. You'd have, hedgerows that wouldn't be destroyed and cut down. Farmers would welcome this. So I would literally suggest that the farmer and the forester should be friends. I worked in Germany as a student, and it was absolutely part and parcel of agriculture and forestry were integrated. But I will take Brendan's point. In all my days in forestry, I felt that we were the Cinderella of the biosciences. Forestry was relegated. We used to have a full-time forestry minister. And now there isn't. And we've, again, when I was with the Forest Service, we were known as the itinerant Forest Service. We were in about 11 different government departments roaming around the place. There was very little corporate memory. But now I think, being positive, here we have a golden opportunity with EU funding. I believe, am I right, Marco, the EU is putting in nearly 100 billion euro into this strategy. It's an incredible amount
I'm going to
of
move
money.
over to Marco now, because I think you had something to say,
We should
Marco.
use it. Yes, okay.
Yes, well, I'm sorry that we don't really have so much time, and there are only 15 minutes left. But I have to say, I have to disagree very strongly with what has been said, particularly by Brendan. We don't really see actually a conflict between climate and biodiversity. And it's actually, in our opinion, in my personal opinion, rather the opposite. Because it seems that you say, climate change is so bad that if we start considering too much biodiversity, well, then we lose it anyway because of climate change. I think it's the opposite. It's the opposite because once we have lost biodiversity, we don't come back to it. And the forestry model that is proposed as an opposite to, as an alternative to solution, that's, well, something that is, it has to sacrifice biodiversity. In reality, we think this is not good for biodiversity, but this is also not good for climate. Because in reality, I mean, we have strong concerns about these figures that have been given about the removal tons by Sitka spruce vis-a-vis native, because in reality, you have to consider the carbon in the soil. You have to consider the interaction between carbon and biodiversity, and what is now called proforestation is showing that the advantage of climate and biodiversity is by protecting forests. So, because it's not the sink only that counts, but it's the stock, it's the carbon stock. If one has to reforest entirely Ireland, one would have to be a lot of, I mean, we are not against, of course, but you are certainly aware of the big problems with planting trees in peatland, the big problems in compromising freshwater pearl mussel habitats, sea harrier habitats, which, by the way, the forest strategy is not binding, but there are binding rules on nature protection, which in some cases have been found to be breached also by the Court of Justice. So I would say we have to be a bit careful on that. And the second thing on which I tend to disagree, although not to such an extent as on this one, is on the economic viability. Of course, it has to be economically viable, but be careful. There is not just timber-related revenue. We have figures showing that the potential economic power of ecosystems different than timber revenue is much greater. So we just have to facilitate this mechanism that foresters can receive money for the ecosystem that their forests provide to society. But there is an enormous potential of ecosystem related economy, which is not related to timber. So we are actually very, very cautious when we hear that you have to have short cycles of Sitka spruces to suck up the carbon. It's actually the contrary. We have to protect biodiversity and at the same time plant the right tree in the right place.
Thank you for that, Marco. I know Dermot and Brendan both want to come in on that. What I would say is that what we're certainly getting today is we've got a number of different perspectives, and that's what this webinar is about, is bringing different perspectives so you as the public can then, put in whatever you want to say to the public consultation for this. Marco has touched on, I suppose, the economy of forestry, and maybe from there we can go and look at talking about green forest jobs and that kind of idea, I suppose the economics and the finance of forestry in Ireland. So can I ask, I'm going to go to Brendan first to get a comment on that, and I think that will also be perhaps related to what you wanted to say in reply to what Marco and Dermot have mentioned. So over to you, Brendan, just again with sort of opportunities for economics, for jobs, and related elements with the forestry plan. Thanks.
Okay. I'll start off by saying in relation to green jobs, we have 12,000 green jobs in this country in the forestry industry, which are currently under severe threat. Secondly, I disagree most strongly with Marco. I don't think he has internalized the threat of global warming. I don't think he's understanding properly the context of biodiversity in Ireland. To put it neatly, we have a completely poverty-stricken biodiversity here. It may be unique in Europe, but in terms of actual biodiversity, what we have is a landscape that was cleared of ice at the Ice Age. The flora and fauna came in. One of the very first pieces of fauna to come in was humans. They brought in fire, they brought in the grazing animals. There isn't a single, as for preserving natural woodlands, they don't exist anymore. It's cod to say they do. Okay, we can preserve some of the most interesting biodiversity areas, and I've no problem with that. I never suggested we should plant on peat because of the carbon equation at all. I don't know where Marco got that from. But what I am saying is that are you prepared to cough up $2 billion a year to meet the planting targets that we need to do it all with native species? And then how are they actually going to get the carbon uptake? It doesn't make any sense. Like, it's purely accidental. First of all, the species that came here. Secondly, the idea that because most of Europe, say, for example, have got rid of their bogs and so on, that we have ecosystems with bogs, or we have the hen area or whatever, all worth protecting. But is he more worth protecting than the grey squirrel, which has been saved by the pine marten, which was saved by the conifers? We could get into all sorts of things like this. What I would ask Marco, though, is base everything on science, make targets, realise the extent of the crisis. Again, the irony that keeps hitting me is that the people who first and most commonly complain about global warming have not internalized the threat at all. And frankly, the idea that we would leave 90% of the countryside unplanted because it has this or that completely degraded ecosystem, man-created deserts essentially, is a complete nonsense. And I understand that Europe-wide, et cetera, but you need to localize it. You need Irish, if you like, solutions based on the local situation. Importing them from Europe has been a disaster and will continue to be a disaster, and we'll still be tweaking around when global warming takes us all over. Okay?
Thanks for that, Brendan. I'm just going to come back to what you mentioned at the start there about the human impact on the landscape and how it has been over thousands of years. And I think one of you made the point that this strategy is about looking to where we are now and looking forward. So certainly, Brendan, you raised some very interesting points there. I think it's also important to remind those listening to us there are points to bear in mind when you're looking at suggestions for this strategy. It's not a policy that's been put in place yet. So I think we're getting various different perspectives here. I'm not going to try to reply to every single question that each of our speakers asked to the other. There simply isn't time, but this is an opportunity to think about the questions that they have raised. Dermot, I'm going to ask you for a comment, and then I'll come back to Marco, and I also have a couple of questions from the people who are watching the webinar. Dermot, did you want to comment on that, and also particularly going back to the opportunities for the green economy within forestry?
Yeah. I mean, I was trying to introduce an air of positivity into our discussion, and I'd agree with Marco. But one area where I disagree is there has to be an economic dimension. Now, Marco, I'm not talking about dollars or euros. I'm talking about natural capital. I'm talking about ecosystem services. I'm talking about non-timber benefits. I'm talking about, I'm not just talking about cubic meters per hectare. And I think you know that. And I think it's unwise just to concentrate on that the investment. There is in Ireland, I see a fantastic, and we in Crown see a fantastic potential for, as I said, cubic meters per hectare is one, timber production, the sawmill industry that Brendan has talked about, but there is a whole potential in green jobs, where we've identified, for example, agroforestry, biotechnology, nursery production, climate change, amelioration, mycoforestry, I have to read these, ecotherapy. I mean, recently I see the forests in Ireland as an antidote to COVID. The amount of people who are out there recreating themselves, engaging in forest therapy. I'm an advisor to the Forest Therapy Institute, and I think Ireland has a fantastic potential for green jobs, for recreation, tourism, biodiversity, leisure, sports, mountain biking, a lot. But the fundamental investment in forestry is to keep a 12,000 workforce engaged in harvesting the product and ensuring that it's done in accordance with sustainable forest management and the Code of Best Forest Practice. So I would like to, emphasize to people, again, when we're submitting before April the 19th, that we have a great potential. There is a marvellous future in planting the right tree in the right place, in engaging in, for example, board and ammonia workers at the moment are being laid off. They could be transitioned into a forest economy based on the whole business of green jobs. So I see, Maeve, okay, I see time is going against us. So Marco, sorry, I'll get back to you.
Thanks, Dermot, on that. And I suppose just to say that I think it's just to go back to what we said at the start, we're looking at social elements, we're looking at economic elements, and we're looking at climate change and environmental element. And there's always going to be conflict there between these three elements. And that's, in some ways what this conversation is about, and what the strategy I would imagine we'll be looking to do is to get the balance in that, which of course is probably going to change from decade to decade. A couple of comments here just before I come back to you, Marco. Just talking about, is there a role for the natural generation of woodlands in the strategy as opposed to planting? And also looking at where hedgerows fit into the figures of 11% of Ireland is currently under forestry. Does that or does that not include hedgerows? I'm not sure who is qualified to answer that question very briefly, and then I'll go back to Marco just to reply to Dermot and Brendan. Brendan's putting his hand up there, and then it'll be over to you, Marco.
No, I was just going to point out that the hedgerows, as far as I know, are not included in the 11%. So just to...
Okay, I'll clarify that. Thank you. Marco, did you want to comment just on the previous comments from Dermot and Brendan?
Very briefly, I had to smile from these allegations of not having interiorized the climate crisis or the disasters of solution imposed by Brussels. Because I think this is I won't comment on these things, but just based on science, 2012, 70 billion euros worth ecosystem were created by forest, of which only 15 were related to timber. This is science. So I can only repeat that we are proposing, based on science, a multifunctionality of forest, where we do not see a contradiction between climate protection and biodiversity. Through proforestation and forest conservation, you can also have better benefits for bioeconomy. Picking up on this very good comment that came up, natural regeneration, of course, is very welcome because let's be clear, I said it in the beginning, the strategy is not all about planting trees. The strategy is also about preserving forests by using forests in the right way, promoting ecotourism. There is a huge potential for promoting ecotourism. So natural regeneration should be actually a priority. The 3 billion trees is a symbolic pledge that shows that, as the Green Deal says, we have to enhance the quantity and quality of European forests. But that doesn't mean that we should not look at other things. And in particular, and I'll finish with that, we want to have a very important role for nature-based solutions. We believe that the solutions to climate come also directly from nature. We have to mimic nature, and nature provides us already for a lot of solutions. So instead of planting trees in peatland, we should preserve peatland, just as an example, and make peatland to be a nature-based solution for climate change and biodiversity, of course.
Okay, thank you, Marco. Now we are just about out of time, so I'm going to give everybody a chance just to say a final few words. I'm going to stick with you for the moment, Marco, just so you can remind us and give us details on how the public can take part in this third phase of the consultation around the forestry strategy for the EU.
Sure. There is a website. It's called Have Your Say. I think the link to the open consultation can be given to the public.
Yes, it's given at the end of this webinar. Yeah.
Right. And you just click in and then put information requests about who you are, what you do, which is not mandatory. And then there are a number of very detailed questions about priority. What do you think it should be the priority for planting trees or for bioeconomy and so on? And we have had so far about, I think, 500, 600 replies, which is not a lot. We expect much more towards the end of the process, and we'll process all these replies and take them into account very seriously. So I really encourage people who are watching us to have a look at that consultation, and of course also send their comments directly to the Commission if they want. You don't have to be just limited by the consultation. If there are other comments that people want to send in, we are actually receiving floods of letters and comments, which we're very happy to read.
Okay, that's great. So thank you, Marco. We'll put all those details up at the end of this webinar for people to see where they can give their feedback and their opinions for the consultation. I'm going to go over to you, Brendan, next, just to give you a chance to give us a few final comments.
Yeah, I still think that clearly people are not getting climate change, especially people who, no, not especially, I mean, we have the climate change deniers on the far right and all the rest of it. But a lot of people who regard themselves as environmentalists clearly either don't understand or appreciate the threat, and certainly the program they're advocating is not going to address the threat at all. We've had our planting program, which was set in '96 for 17% forest cover, has failed miserably. We're only planting about 2,000 hectares now, and the reason given is because of other environmental restrictions, legal planning, but basically we're told it's all coming from EU directives. I think that is an important thing that they should look at their own hearts to address. Second, I don't think Marco has taken on board what I said. I've never suggested that we don't plant native woodlands. I've never suggested that we plant on peatland. That still leaves like 70% of the country. I don't think Marco appreciates the urgency of the climate issue, the fact that the climate issue trumps biodiversity, and that the two can be, not always are, but certainly can be in conflict. If you want to preserve degraded habitats that have one or two species, I mean, you mentioned the hen harrier. Recently, a whole heap of hen harrier sites were delisted. Why? Because there hasn't been a hen harrier in them since they were originally listed by the Irish side 3 years ago. And it was at so there's huge problems with the whole EU regime. And I don't believe it's tailored to localities. And I would actually say that what Marco is advocating is a very populist approach, but not one that's going to solve anything in relation to biodiversity or climate change. This is an emergency. Whatever we do, we have to do in the next 19 years if we're going to talk carbon lockup. I don't get any sense of urgency whatsoever from Marco.
Thanks for that, Brendan. Again, another perspective, and once again, there is the opportunity to get that message across through taking part in the public consultation, you know, the urgency around climate change that Brendan has outlined. Dermot, you're going to get the final word this afternoon. Any final comments from you, please?
Well, thanks, May. Well, in Crown, we realise that the EU, and I've just made a note of this, aims to be climate neutral by 2050 by reducing emissions and decarbonising the environment and getting, as we say, to net zero. Now, I see that there's a fantastic opportunity for Ireland in this by practising sustainable forest management, as I said, the three criteria, and I do emphasise economics, environment, and social. And we can do this by practicing sustainable forest management in accordance with what we had before, a code of best forest practice and a suite of environmental guidelines that showed we were implementing sustainable forest management and that all timber produced in Ireland was derived from sustainably managed forest. And I'd agree with Marco, we have to have a programme of sustainable forest management in accordance with the Lisbon criteria and whatever. So my final words, and I actually wrote them down here, I think that forests have a major role to play in achieving these objectives, really do, and that they will ensure social, economic and environmental values of our forests. We have to maintain and enhance the forests for present and future generations. And I think we can do this by increasing our forest cover from 11. You didn't come with a target. I think it should be up to 25%. Done, and I emphasise, done in accordance with sustainable forest management principles. And what I started, the first words I said were by planting the right trees in the right places with the right management. Again, thanks for that. That's my final words.
Thanks, Dermot. I think that's been a message the whole way through, the right trees in the right places. Thank you to all of our speakers, to Mark Onida, from the Director General for the Environment at the European Commission, Brendan Fitzsimon, CEO of the Tree Council of Ireland, and Dermot Mackery, Director of Crown Trees for Ireland. Information on how you can become involved in the public consultation process will be on screen at the end of this presentation if you want to have your say in the EU forestry policy. So I'm going to give a final thank you to everybody, and a thank you to Europe Direct Sligo for hosting this webinar. And thanks also to those of you who watched our Facebook live stream and who booked through Eventbrite. This piece will be up on YouTube later today and will be on the Europe Direct Sligo website as well. So thank you all, everybody. We look forward to your consultations or your comments for the consultation, and stay safe. Thank you.
Fine, thank you.